I love this story. I don't know when I first heard it. I have no memory of that. It's not one you usually tell children. God is scary enough without having to think of wrestling God. Talk about being on the wrong weight class or outclassed. But somewhere along the way, I heard this story and it drew me in. It's one of those stories that says, play with me. It's one of those stories meaning that calls you to it, meaning that you can dream and imagine many things going on in this story. You can live with this story in many different ways. It gives you something different every time you encounter it. It's a multifaceted jewel that shines brightly in the midst of the story of the people of Israel. There are 100 different ways to read it. If you read it culturally, following the whole story, it stands against the norms of the culture. The culture at the time said the oldest son inherited it all and used that wealth and resources for the care of the whole family. Well, practically what happens if the oldest son isn't the sharpest tack in the tack box? Your family is in trouble, in deep trouble. You're stuck because the older brother rules, and that's the end of the story. Well, you know, God doesn't like that kind of thing. God is always challenging that kind of thing and making everything new. And so God challenges that cultural thing through this story of Jacob. And actually, this cultural norm is challenged so many times in biblical stories, it would lead one to wonder if most of the writers of the biblical stories were younger sons. You can also read this story from a developmental psychology view. Here is a young, brash, arrogant man. Many of them exist. He thinks he is invincible and he can get away with anything. He is so arrogant he doesn't play by the rules. He becomes the trickster, tricking his older brother out of his birthright and his blessing. And he runs when he gets in trouble instead of facing the world and the trouble. And now he doesn't have his mom to cover for him. So he gets tricked by an even trickier guy, his Uncle Laban, and then he ends up working 14 years for 2 brides, and this gives him a little maturity, a little edge, a little knowledge of the world and how it works, and he begins to mature. Then he outsmarts his Uncle Laban, and he returns home to his brother, an older and wiser man. You can also read this story from the sibling rivalry point of view. You may be the older brother or the younger sister, or always feel like dad doesn't favor you, or mom doesn't favor you, or he always gets his own way, or she always gets away with everything. You can look at the entire situation from an anthropological development. The hunter-gatherers, Esau, not too bright, are being replaced by the herders-farmers, meaning Jacob. And so the story was written from the herder-farmer point of view. Obviously, they are more intelligent and going to make it in the world, and the world will pass by the hunter-gatherers. That's the way you could read it that one way. You can look at this story from a psychological perspective. People like Freud or Jung. Jungian psychologists have a field day with this story. People write PhDs. Dissertations on these 10 verses in the scriptures. You can read about egos and ids and superegos and dreams and consciousness and unconsciousness stuff and have a field day with it. It's just amazing, all that's in there if you read it from a Jungian perspective. We can look at this story from a healing perspective. Here's Jacob, who's been carrying around all his guilt in his heart for 20 years, and he doesn't know what to do about it, and then he becomes mature enough to say, I've got to seek forgiveness, and I've got to get rid of this guilt. And so he wrestles with his conscience. That's what he's really wrestling with that night. It's not God, it's not an angel, it's his conscience. You know, the little guy in the shoulder that says, do it. The other one that says, don't do it. So he's wrestling with his conscience so he can face his brother again and beg for forgiveness and get rid of that load of guilt. So there's another way that you can read this story. It's the story that's just chock full of good things and many ways to read it. It's one of those scriptures that proves to me that this Bible is holy and the Word of God because it still has so much meaning. I mean, this story happened 4,000 years ago, and we still read it, and we still get out of it. Did they get Jungian ego, id, super id, ego things out of it? Heck no. But it was a great story, and they learned about guilt and forgiveness and growing up and all that kind of good stuff from it. We, 4,000 years later, can read all that stuff back into it. So it still speaks to us, it still calls to us, it still grabs a hold of us and makes us wrestle with it and figure out what it's all about. So no matter who we are, no matter where we are in our life story, somehow we will connect with this story on a personal basis. So much of our Bible is like that. God knew how to create and touch us forever with words, simple but lasting. Stories like this hit us in a different way every time we read it, because we're different. And we're all young and foolish, or older and wiser, or the sibling, or the guilty. Somehow something is there that will touch you, and that's marvelous, and it's miraculous. And every one of us will come away with a different story, a different angle, a different connection. And somehow it will bring us closer to God, and somehow it will bring us closer to one another as we learn to reconcile and live together and do all those good things. It's marvelous and miraculous. And remember I spoke to you that I said, God up here, Jacob down here. Well, if we go back to Noah, Noah down here, God up here. We go back to Abraham, down here, up here. We come now to this wrestling moment like this. This is not like this anymore. Adam and Eve, walking through the garden together with God, wonderful, intimate connections. And then we lost all of that. We lost the garden. So all of a sudden, down here, up here. Now, with this Jacob, this creation of Israel, the man to be the father of the nations, boom, here we are, Jacob and God, wrestling face to face. Face to face. This covenant that God made with Adam and Eve, and Noah, and Abraham is still going on as they wrestle with one another up close and personal. But as many ways as we can each take this story, and we'll all go home with our piece of the puzzle, there's one thing I hope we all get out of it as we leave here today. And that's the message that we don't ever give up. Not even when your opponent is God. Don't ever give up. Some commentaries wonder, is this a demon, as in a devil? There are certain ways you can read this story, culturally. It could be a demon, very easily. Jacob is wrestling because, they only come out at night, and this and that and the other thing. Now, some commentaries wonder if it's his guilty subconscious he's really fighting with. Some will say it's an angel, it's a divine being. You can read it all those ways. And depending on where you're at in your life journey, one of those ways may speak to you of what you are wrestling with at this moment, and what you need to hear. We could read it any one of those ways. But when I read it, I may read it, it's one of these things here, part of the story, but when I'm finished with the story for that time and place, it always ends up being God. You see, God wanted to prove and test Jacob to see if he was really changed and if he was really ready to go from here to here, wrestling face to face with God. Jacob has always walked with God. God was his buddy. But Jacob was being the trickster. And Jacob was being funny. And Jacob was, stealing birthrights. And Jacob was, and it's not really walking with God, because God doesn't want us to be stealing birthrights, etc. And I think that's kind of illustrated in this story when the trickster once again gets tricked by God. Y'all read that, didn't you? And you think, that's not fair. God touched him in the hip and threw his hip out of joint. That's not fair. That's tricky. Well, once again, Jacob is confronted with, is tricky good? Is tricky the way we do it? No. Jacob has to learn at this point, if he's going to be the leader of the nation, if he's going to fulfill all the promises that God has put in store for him, that he has to turn from the trickster ways and live with this God and walk with this God and obey this God and follow this God's ways. That he might find forgiveness and peace and reconciliation with his brother. He has to find that forgiveness and peace and reconciliation with God. And become the man that God knows he to be and God made him to be. It was night because God was protecting Jacob. It was believed that if he lived upon the face of God, he would die. Moses was the exception to the rule here. He comes a little bit later on, and he's also face to face with God. But God did not want to hurt Jacob, and so he wrestled with him at night. But with the coming sunrise, Jacob would then look upon the face of God and die. That would mess up the whole plan of father of nations, you know? So they end their wrestling match, and Jacob goes on the next day to meet his brother Esau, and they are wonderfully reconciled. Again, I would encourage you to read the next few chapters so you can read about their reconciliation. It's very nice. So here's Jacob, walked in a wrestling match with God, going for it all now, reconciliation with his brother, claiming the promises of leading his own people, and Jacob, tenacious, troublemaker Jacob, won't let go until he gets a blessing. You may read this story 100 different ways. You may see this story 100 different ways than I do, but I want you to see every time I look at this passage, I walk away with it. You hang on until you get the blessing. Don't ever give up until you've gotten, until you've received, until you've claimed the blessing God has for you. Hold up. Don't let go. And don't forget to ask for the blessing. So often we just wrestle and we never ask. Ask for the blessing. If you let go too early, you won't get the benefit of the struggle and get to the other side and get the blessing. How often is it that we give up, run away, try to hide, tell God no, and what we really need to do is wrestle and ask for the blessing. How often is it when you are at the end of your rope and then and only then is when you turn to God? Don't wait until trouble hits. Turn to God now. Stay with God. Wrestle with God until you receive the blessing. Samuel Wesley is the father of John Wesley, and he was once watching his wife Susanna teach in their home school. And she patiently said the same thing to the child 19 times until the child finally learned whatever the concept was she was teaching. Samuel could not believe her patience. And she replied, "It was the 19th time that crowned it. If I stopped any earlier, I would have lost all that effort. If you stop too early, you lose all that effort. Hang on to God. Don't let go until you receive the blessing." Remember, in the past few weeks, we've talked about God sowing seeds, and some fall on the good soil and some fall on the shallow soil. And if you let go too early, it's like that seed being in shallow soil. It grows for a time, then it withers because it has to come down. And you wrestle with God. You must go deeper. Stay in contact with God every day and every way. Wrestle with whatever the trouble is. It doesn't matter. God's good and strong. God can take it. Go ahead, wrestle. Argue, rant, rave, beat heads. Wrestle and hold on and never let go until you see the sunshine of a new day and claim the blessing. Those who let go too early will not receive the blessing or not a full blessing. If you hang on for dear life and ask God for a blessing in the midst of the wrestling match, be it storm, grief, trial, temptation, trouble, you will receive a blessing. Because our God is good at turning grapes into wine, yeast into bread, 5 loaves and 2 fish into enough to feed a hungry crowd. Hang on for the blessing. Just hang on and and never let go.